Hey guys, this is Colin Moshman for CardsChat.com, and we're continuing on right now with me and Katie's course, Become a Winning Poker Player in 30 Days. And the topic of day 12 is river betting, the crucial late street question that for me I first encountered in the classic Harrington and Hold'em series, which is an incredibly powerful idea. And we're going to start by making sure we understand that question, give a couple of examples, and then look at spots where it doesn't apply before moving on to actual hands that show this idea in action. So let's begin with the question itself, which is a pretty simple one. And that is, if I bet or raise, what better hands will fold and what worse hands will call. So in other words, at the river, you're only betting for one of two reasons. You're betting for value to get worse hands to call, or as a bluff to get better hands to fold. There's absolutely no other reason to bet at the river. And just understanding that concept and asking yourself this question when you're considering making an aggressive play at the river is something that will give you an immediate leg up on your opponents who are not doing the same type of analysis. So let's give a couple of spots not to bet or raise as a result of this concept. Now first, what does it mean when we say 9x or ace x? What it means is that in the top example, we hold a 9 and our other card is not important. It doesn't affect the analysis. So we have our two cards as normal, but the only important one is a 9. So here there's a 10 jack queen king on board, and that means that when we have a 9, are any better hands going to fold? Absolutely not. The only better hand is an ace, which is the nuts. So clearly that hand is not going to fold. Or any worse hands going to call? Now, occasionally the answer is yes. Let's say it's a limped pot that's been checked all the way down. And in that case, maybe your opponent will call with a one pair hand or as a bluff catcher. But for the most part, this is a very obvious straight to have. An opponent who can't beat a 9, who just has a one pair, two pair hand, is probably going to fold if you bet. So usually when you hold a 9 on 10 jack queen king, all better hands are going to call you, and the vast majority of worse hands are going to fold. So this is not a good time to make an aggressive play. You can check, you can call, but you should not be betting or raise in the vast majority of situations holding a 9 there. And similarly holding an ace on the double paired board. So if your opponent has king high, queen high, usually they're not going to call. Whereas if they have a full house or an overpair, then they're going to call the vast majority of the time. So again, not set in stone, but these are really good spots to take passive actions instead of aggressive actions once you apply the framework of the river betting question. Now, one thing that we've talked about is that this is pretty river specific. And there are times when you want to apply this idea to flop and turn, but I want to talk about why that's not always going to be the case. And the reason for that is we have this thing called an equity denial bet, which is betting with the purpose of getting a worse hand to fold because that worst hand still has good equity against us. So let me pull up the Nice Street Program Ecolab and give us an example of this concept. So in this example, let's say that the flop is something like 10-8 deuce. Suits don't matter too much, but we'll make this a rainbow flop. And we have pocket threes. So if we bet in this spot, depending on the action, for the most part, all better hands are going to call. So if our opponent has a 10 or an 8 or pocket nines, he's probably going to call. So we're not really going to get better hands to fold, and we're not going to get too many worse hands to call. So an ace high kind of hand is usually going to fold. But at the same time, we can bet for equity denial. So let's say that our opponent has some kind of random hand like queen 7. Okay, so in this case, he can still hit an overpair to our pocket threes, and he's going to win this pot 28% of the time if this hand gets checked down. So we can bet for the purpose of getting a worse hand that still has pretty good equity against us to fold, so that our equity goes up from 72% in this case to 28%. And there's one special example of an equity denial bet, which is a protection bet. So if you're betting specifically to target some kind of obvious draw, like a flush draw or open-ended straight draws, then that's a form of an equity denial bet. But the it's usually going to be called a bet for protection. So you're protecting your hand against some kind of obvious draw, whereas equity denial more has the connotation that your opponent has two random cards that just happen to have some equity against us. So very related ideas there. Now, if you happen to have good showdown value on the flop and turn, it's fine to check and just look to showdown cheaply, but betting does still have the purpose of increasing your equity from something that's above 50% to 100%. So this is one of the more subtle questions in poker. You're at the flop or the turn, you think you have the best hand. If you ask yourself the fundamental river question, you usually get a bad response. In other words, that you're not going to get many better hands to fold or many worse hands to call. But at the same time, betting has the purpose of denying equity. And so this is one of the times where there's not always going to be a clear answer. And it's just going to come down to what do you know about your opponent, your style, and an art to it. So we'll look at some more examples of this both today as well as in a couple of the later sections. So with this said, why don't we go ahead and look at direct hand examples of applying the river betting question in action. So we'll begin with this nice high quality hand, 7-3 offsuit. The cutoff open limps, the small blind completes, we of course check. Now we're going to be focusing mainly on river play, but I definitely want to talk about flop and turn play as well, in part for this idea of learning more about equity denial, protection bets, and in part because it's just cool and interesting stuff. So here I like betting this flop, and the reason why I like betting is because of the fact that these guys can have substantial equity combined against us. So let's say, for example, that this player has a hand like 10-8 of hearts, and this guy has Jack 9 with a spade. Well, combined, they're going to have 12 outs, 12 cards they can hit to get a higher pair than us. They've got some backdoor draws in there. So they have a lot of combined equity. So we normally have the best hand, and I will go ahead and bet for that reason, to deny them their equity and get value with what's likely a best hand. Here it checks, which is okay. We'll head to a turn, check once again. And so the question is, do we bet or check this river? And now there's nothing besides the fundamental river question. We're at the river, we're considering displaying aggression. So let's talk first. If somebody has a worse hand, will they call us? And here the answer is almost certainly no. A worse hand is going to be a deuce. There's 4 cards to a straight out there. It's very unlikely somebody is going to call us with a worse hand if we bet. So we're not going to be value betting here. Will somebody with a better hand fold? And the answer here is some of the time, but not too often. If somebody has a 4, they probably would have bet already. There's a good chance that a 9 is going to have bet. So maybe a 6 will occasionally fold if we put out a big bet. But for the most part, somebody who has a better hand than us, or a river at 5 for sure, is not going to fold. So there's really not a point in betting this river. If people have worse hands, they're going to fold them. If people have better hands, they're going to at least call. So the correct play is to check. And that's what Hero does. He folds. So once we check, the question is, well, what do we do then? And that comes down a lot to our opponent. Here we beat bluffs, and this might be a good spot to call the bluff catch against an aggressive opponent, but checking the river was the correct decision rather than betting. Now we're going to look at an MTT spot with pocket 9s. Here raises under the gun. We face a re-raise, a 3-bet from the player in the hijack. And the correct play here is going to be to call and take a flop. We're getting pretty good implied odds, and also our hand has decent showdown value. We don't always need to hit a set in order to win this pot. So this is a good raise and then call pre-flop. At the flop, our plan is going to be to check call with our overpair, but our opponent checks back. And now we hit our set, a beautiful thing. Hero bets half pot, which looks good. Our opponent calls. And the question here is, should we check or bet this river? Now, if somebody has a better hand than us, they're not going to fold. At least it's extremely unlikely. Somebody, for example, has a 3 or pocket aces, then it's very unlikely that they're going to fold that hand. Will somebody call with a worse hand? And here the answer to that is yes, we can value bet and get worse hands to call us. Now there are 4 cards to a straight, kind of like the 10 Jack Queen King example, but this time it's a lot less relevant. There are not too many hands this guy is going to re-raise us with pre-flop that contain a 3. Similarly, he knows that there are not too many hands we're going to raise under the gun that contain a 3. So there being 4 to a straight out here doesn't really have too much implication on this hand. And there are plenty of worse hands they're going to call us. In particular, any ace is very likely to call us. So we should go ahead and bet here for value to get called by worse hands. That's exactly what Hero does. He overbets, which might look bluffy. And we get called by ace king, win a big pot. So very well played river decision. With ace-9 offsuit, we raise from the hijack. This is the worst hand I would raise. I would fold worse offsuit aces since there is 4 players left to act. And with ace-9 offsuit, though, this is a good raise. Our opponent calls. And here are bets. So the first question I want to talk about is this a good flop bet? And because of the flush draw, this is a fine flop bet. Our opponent... So this would be a bet for protection rather than equity denial. We're looking to charge flush draws. Our opponent could also call us with different worse hands such as king, queen, pocket fives. So this is certainly a reasonable spot to bet. And we get called. Our opponent now bets out the turn. This is a donk bet. A lot of the time, these turn donk bets are going to be weak or bluffy. At the same time, there's not much purpose in raising because then we don't allow a bluffing opponent to continue bluffing. So I would definitely be calling here, as Hero correctly does. And now our opponent checks. So the question you want to ask here is, 1, what should we do with our hand, as well as what hands make sense to check back here? Okay, so in this instance, for me, I would be betting for value, betting for the purpose of getting a worse hand to call me if I have any ace or better. So obviously with the deuce, with the straight. Notice here that even if we have ace-6 offsuit, we're playing ace-ace, deuce-deuce, king. So we're chopping against any other ace that our opponent has that's not, that doesn't connect with the board in some other way. So it's pretty unlikely that our opponent's going to be checking a better hand than this. It's very likely we have the best hand. So with an ace, a deuce, or better, I'm going to be betting those hands. And then hands that also make sense to bet are bluffs. So for example, if we have 9 high, this would make a lot of sense to bet. Maybe we have 9-8 of spades. We could go ahead and bet that hand. Hands that do not make as much sense to bet are going to be if we had some kind of random 3x hand. Like for whatever reason we had queen 3 suited, I wouldn't be raising that hand pre-flop. Maybe we misclick and we raise that hand. Pocket 6s, king 10. Those are hands that fail the test. Ace-9 for me is good enough that I will go ahead and put out a value bet, but not crazy to check this back. And we do settle for a chop here. Playing the ace-ace, deuce-deuce, king. Now we'll look at an example from a low-stakes sitting go. Hero raises with pocket fives. Limping is also a good play. Normally I'd limp here or put in a raise to 90, but raising to 75 works. And this is one of these spots where you're not going to go right and you're not going to go wrong. If our opponent has a worse hand than ours, he's probably going to fold. If he has a better hand, he's almost certainly going to call. But we can bet for equity denial and protection. So we could bet saying, hey, you know what? If our opponent has some hand like king 8, I want to go ahead and charge him. Or we can bet for protection as well. So there's a protection element to that bet, since our opponent could have, for example, an open-ended straight draw. So we're betting to get a hand that's worse than ours, but still has good equity to fold. So that would be a completely legitimate approach. And it's also a totally legitimate approach to check and say, hey, you know what? I think I have the best hand. I've got some showdown value. It's going to be tough to get a lot of worse hands to call me. And I'm just going to check and look to try to show this hand down cheaply. So here checks. Again, totally fine. Our opponent checks back. And I will go ahead and bet now for protection / equity denial. It's much less likely that our opponent has a speed given that he checks back the flop. And as played, I would bet the river. So it's very unlikely that our opponent has a 10 or a 9, given that he's checked back both flop and turn. Even a 6 is much less likely. We have kind of a surprisingly strong hand for the way this is played out. So for me, I would bet here for the purpose of getting a worse hand to call. Doesn't look like we're strong. We might get a hand like a random 3, such as 5-3 or ace high to call us. So I would bet for value here. Instead we check, and the correct play is going to be to check call. And this is a misstep. Our hand is, again, surprisingly strong given the action. We can say our hand is underrepresented. And so I would definitely bluff catch because we've played this hand in a deceptive way. Next hand is going to be Queen 10 offsuit. Button raises, we're going to call, which looks good. At the flop, we're going to check call. The turn gets checked, and the question here is, should we bet river? So I think you guys are probably getting pretty used to this by now. Let's begin with our worst hands going to call if we bet. Here the answer is probably not. There's a chance that someone will just not believe us or put us on a busted flush draw and will call us with a hand like 9x or 7x. But for the most part, with forward or straight out there, worse hands are going to fold when we bet. What about better hands? Are any better hands going to fold? And here the answer is probably not. If our opponent had a jack, he's not going to fold most likely. He would also have bet a jack at the turn. Certainly he's not going to fold an 8. So maybe a better 10, a hand like King 10 might fold. But for the most part, when we bet here, we're going to get worse hands to fold and better hands to call. So for that reason, I would check here and usually check call. I wouldn't tend to fold, given that our opponent shouldn't have too many 8x hands. So we lose that one, but I do very much like the line that Hero takes. And now we're getting to today's big quiz question. So early in a multi-table sit and go, we have 2 players who limp. For me, I would be putting out a raise here with ace-queen. This is very likely to be the best hand. So I would raise to about 200. Instead, Hero calls. And we plan to check fold this flop. It gets checked around. We plan to check fold this turn. It gets checked around. Something interesting happens. The river pairs the 9. And so I ask you guys, would this be a good spot to now bet? So that is your quiz question. Think about it. Pause the video and we'll answer. Okay, so the correct answer here is no. This is not a good spot to bet because of our river betting framework. Imagine that our opponent has worse than us. It's very unlikely that they're going to call a worse hand. If our opponent has a hand like King High, they're almost certainly going to fold. It's a multi-way spot. It's going to be really tough to get a worse hand than Ace High to call us. What about better hands than ours folding? That's also going to be very difficult. If somebody has a Jack or a 9, they probably would have already bet. And people know that once the flop and turn get checked around, that any pair is a relatively strong hand. So if somebody does have an 8 or a 4, they're probably going to call us. So the correct play here is definitely going to be to check. And we have real showdown value. We'll talk about this more in the section on logic and hand reading. But again, if somebody has a 9 or a jack, they'll probably have bet already at this point in the hand. There's some chance they've also would have bet an 8. Certainly they would have bet a straight. So occasionally we're going to get shown some kind of random 4x hand or an 8. But I'd say at least half the time we have the best hand here. Betting does not accomplish anything, and the correct answer is that we should check. See how this plays out. And we have the best hand against the button, best hand against the big blind, clean sweep, best hand against under the gun, and Hero takes this pot. All right, so the really important thing is, even if you don't feel totally clear on the earlier street concepts that we sort of introduced today, that you feel confident asking yourself and answering the river betting question. Soon we're going to get to, I believe, day 16, which is going to talk more about flop and turn play and what we should do more in those spots. But river play in this question, super important, and an immediate leg up on your opposition who does not understand this concept as well. So thanks very much for watching. This has been Colin Moshman for the Become a Winning Poker Player in 30 Days course with Katie Dozier for CardsChat.com.